Good morning. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to this webinar entitled Charities Emerging from Lockdown. I'm Andy Shaw, I'm a partner with Anderson & Brown. I'm joined today by Alan Eccles from BKF & Co and Lauren Mcilroy from AAB. So what we're talking about today, we start with Alan talking about how the law can help charities and the third sector in and beyond lockdown. Then I will pick up on trading subsidiary gift aid considerations, thinking really here about losses post year end and how they impact on gift aid. And then Lauren will talk about automation and how it helps you to manage your charity's finances. We have a Q&A function, so if you have any questions for the presenters during the presentation, then please use it, and we'll leave time at the end of each session to pick up on those questions. So we hope you enjoy it, and I will move on now to Alan.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Andy. Hopefully everyone can see and hear everything. I'm going to look at some of the legal issues that are cropping up at the moment as we emerge from lockdown, and also not just emerging from lockdown, but actually succeeding, thriving, and all that as we come out of being stuck in our houses at the moment. And one of the things that has struck me is that the law is usually seen as a problem, gets in the way of things, but actually at the moment for charities, some of the legal things that are happening might actually be able to help a charity further its purposes and succeed. And one of those has been the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020. Firstly, because I'm a loser and my interest thresholds are different from the normal human, it very much interested me that this was called a Governance Act, which is really the first time outside certain areas of local government law and further in higher education that we've got governance actually in a piece of legislation. So that I think is quite an interesting thing in its own right. But what this is doing is helping all sorts of organisations, not just charities, but it will be very helpful for charities to actually undertake key bits of governance that due to social distancing really would have been difficult or almost impossible for some organisations to actually put in place, partly because of the physical side of it, but also because their articles of association, rules, constitution, etc. would have prevented them from taking advantage of electronic means. So what's going to be put in place is measures that are going to allow certain constitutional provisions to be relaxed up until 30 September 2020, and it could be extended by Scottish Government as far as Scottish entities up until April next year. So what is this legislation doing? Well, it applies irrespective of the terms of your constitution. So if your constitution is going to cause you a problem at the moment and the Governance Act fixes that problem, then you don't need to worry about your constitution. The Governance Act provides the answer and overrides what is in your articles. It extends the timeframes for AGMs to be held. So if you were supposed to have held your AGM but couldn't because of lockdown, etc., you can extend that out to 30 September this year, and that is still valid. You're going to be allowed to hold virtual meetings. But that's virtual meetings of members or shareholders. Obviously, the charities, it's going to be usually members, but there are some company that are limited by shares that are used for charities. So membership organisations, and particularly large membership organisations, are going to find these rules very helpful because it is going to allow them to run virtual members meetings. It's not just AGMs. If there are any other members meetings happening, EGMs, etc., or not just ones that were sort of due to take place, but there may be reasons that you want to bring forward some business in to this period of time in which the Governance Act allows virtual meetings to take place. It might even be that you bring forward things to have a virtual meeting to enact rules that update your articles to allow virtual meetings and the like to happen in the future. A very helpful bit of the rules is, unsurprisingly, with social distancing, there is no need for anyone to be in the same place to have a valid meeting under these relaxed provisions, and that can be very helpful for making sure you can actually get the quorum for your meeting, because you don't need to have 2 people in the same place. Everyone can be in different places and still have a valid meeting. Voting can be done electronically, so you know, that gets around the issues that would be associated with the physical sides of, you know, putting hands up and all that. A flip side of the voting relaxations is that some member/shareholder rights are suspended. No member can demand to appear at a meeting in person. No member can demand to vote in a particular way, for example. So, and the only things that members are entitled really to be doing at these meetings is to vote. They cannot demand to speak in these meetings. So, whilst these rules are about facilitating things and making it easier, we have to remember that in some ways members are losing certain powers that they have, but that is only temporary, and trustees should very much remember that members are very powerful, particularly under company law. They have a lot of powers: sack the board, change the purposes, change the constitution. So if trustees were seeking to in any way take advantage of this after the 30th of September, the powers of members fully return. Should also mention it's important for organisations actually to check who the members are. It wouldn't be the first time in my life where people think they have no members and then realise that they do have members, and actually they're the ones in control, not the trustees. I've seen an awful lot of charities whereby the members and therefore the people in control of the charity are actually random agents who set up companies, and they were the first members, and that was never changed. So making sure you have the right members and you know who members are and what their powers are is not a bad reminder out of this. And there's some relaxation in company house filings as well. The rules apply to basically corporate entities, so companies, including charitable companies, SCIOs, KICs, community interest companies, English CEOs, SCIOs in form of CIOs, and a variety of mutual societies, credit unions, etc. can utilise these rules. Trusts and unincorporated associations are not included. This might just be another example of where trusts and unincorporated associations are, in my opinion, and I'm very happy to have this recorded, are generally rubbish things to be. They are danger zones and have very little to commend themselves. There we are. That is the wonderful world of lockdown seminars, is they are generally recorded, and you have to be careful about what you're saying, and I am being careful, and what I'm saying is trusts and unincorporated associations are bad. But we might come back to that a little bit later on. And there are some charities that are set up by statute, not that many of them, but there are, you know, enough of them out there, and they tend to be quite historic, sometimes have a degree of profile attached to them, and sometimes quite large. If they're set up by statute, then they should refer to their own governing legislation as to how they can conduct meetings, etc. during lockdown. Often on the topic of meetings, certainly trustee meetings, there's usually where they have to be careful is on how they run their member meetings, and particularly where they have a larger membership. So if Andy flipped over to the next slide, I've got my representation of what a charities EGM in 2020 could look like, with everyone in their own little Lego houses, on their Lego computers or tablets or phones or whatever, engaging with the meeting. And on that, and if we go on to the next slide, it's not all about this being about how we can do meetings just as easily as possible and as simply as possible. We have to remember that we still want to have proper engagement and effective meetings, and the guidance that goes along with the Governance Act makes it very clear that proper engagement is expected. So the preparation for an EGM or any other member meeting might be greater this year than other years, to give people an opportunity to receive information, digest it, maybe ask questions in advance, so that by the time it comes to the meeting, which might be say a virtual meeting where it might be a bit more difficult for everyone to be contributing and certain member rights are suspended, that the build up to the meeting has given that opportunity for proper engagement, and when it's coming to the vote, then people feel they have been properly communicated with. Because so often in my experience, where there has been any contention around decisions, whether that's trustees or at a member level, if people feel that they've been heard, they've had the right information, they usually accept a decision. It's where people feel they haven't been treated correctly or been given a chance to engage, that people feel a bit more grumpy, and sometimes that can lead to problems. I should just mention on engagement, effective meetings, proper decision making, that it's as if these things are timed. Oscar issued an inquiry report this week to do with Aberdeen University, and it had its specifics to that case, but there are a lot of very helpful and useful general pointers for trustee decision making, the running of subcommittees, meetings, information flow that are worthwhile having a read in that inquiry report, and I have said to myself, and I'm now saying it out live to the world, that I am definitely going to blog about it. So there'll be something available soon that summarises what that inquiry report is about. And the Charity Commission in England and Wales issued a governance alert not that long ago, which had some similar messages in it. So yes, this is all about doing things in a more simple way, but the quality of decision making must be remembered. And as part of that, I mean, people, I suspect, have now decided that Zoom quizzes on a Friday night are maybe not the most cool thing anymore. They were amazing a few weeks ago. Do we all love online stuff? Yes, it's very helpful, but how do we feel about it? Does it really work? Making sure that online meetings, however they are conducted, both from the tech side of it and just the etiquette and making sure people feel comfortable, are these things actually leading to an effective and workable meeting that everyone feels comfortable with? I'm sure there will be PhD dissertations in the future about what type of people do best in a physical meeting, and what type of people come out best and contribute most in Zoom and other meetings. But it's the robustness and quality of decision making remains the same. And with that, we've got a Governance Act. There is no harm in just reminding yourselves of bits in the Governance Code. I'm not going to go over it. It's on the slide there. The only bit I would highlight, which is always my key governance rule, and it probably applies very neatly in the current climate, is if people are polite and courteous to each other, then the board is probably going to have good governance. Whenever people feel that that has fallen away, that is when you have problems, because so much of it is about that collective responsibility when it comes to the board level. Perhaps we could pop on to the next slide very briefly. One of the reasons why I'm speaking very briefly about this is I know nothing of insolvency law, so I'm on weak ground here when I talk about this, but I was asking colleagues who do know about this stuff, what does the insolvency bits of this legislation mean when it came out? And they said, well, on the face of it, it's a huge relaxation of insolvency rules and things like wrongful trading rules. The personal liability is much more limited than it was in the past. But the reality of these rules is it's not a get out of jail card, and certainly for charity trustees, the usual standards of governance around solvency, financial management should apply. And if there is one case study that is worth always having a wee look at from time to time, it's the OnePlus experience from a decade or so ago, which had lots of things for charity trustees to look at, but it certainly gave lessons about fundamental financial management to make sure you actually knew you were solvent and could continue to operate. Now onto my greatest artwork ever. This is lockdown seminar creation stuff here. Just a very brief one on structure choice. I mentioned I'm a loser earlier, and one of the most sad things I do is each month I count up how every charity in Scotland and also community interest company. It's created to keep track of the numbers of them, see which ones are popular and what legal structures people are using. And sometimes I put together graphs and other representations of it. And this is my latest attempt at it. Very briefly, SCIOs continue to be far and away the most popular Scottish charitable incorporated organisations. They very much are infinity and beyond in the sense of the percentage of their market share in new charities is huge now. And they're really good. I think they are really handy, very flexible, as well as giving limited liability and corporate status and all of that. The one thing I would mention, and it's one of the issues that Buzz Lightyear has, is don't get sucked into the idea that there is just one single type or model of SCIO. It has to suit your organisation. You don't just want to have the one or two lines that are built into you that you can speak. You want to be able to have a charity constitution that fits your organisation, which is an important thing with SCIOs. Companies, Batman, he's robust, he is functional, he can do lots of great things, but as Lego Batman was, he's a bit brusque, maybe he's not the most cultured, maybe not the most modern, and certainly is becoming a bit less popular in new charities. They certainly have their place. Companies are good. If you're an existing company for a charity, stick with it, I would say, in most cases. But for new ones, it's probably SCIOs or companies. Companies have their place, particularly if you're going to be engaging in a large project that needs funding and you want to be able to grant a floating charge. They are able to do that. SCIOs aren't. Unincorporated associations, generally a danger zone. I could, well, if I was allowed to, under the new rules, actually I think I can have two people who have been involved in unincorporated associations come into my house and say, I have had to spend my own money for debts, liabilities and risks associated with that unincorporated association. They are generally a bit of a danger zone. And for those, you can see my little Playmobil people there. I don't think they're in the same historic era, so apologies about that. But you will see that they are in a canoe, but they have no paddles. That is the world of being in an unincorporated association when it goes wrong. You have no paddles. You are stuffed, often. And it's personal liability. And trusts are fantastic when it comes to private family succession planning, but for charities are probably not the best. They're quite restrictive. They have personal liability. Unfortunately, they're now pretty rare. I mean, this month there was only 2 new charities set up. Let's move on to the next slide, which is about funding and income streams. And there's a few on there, and I don't want to look at all of them. Online, that's going to be more popular. Remember data, GDPR, all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to nip down to trading subsidiary payments. Andy's going to talk about that. There are some legal sides to that. I would also just say with trading subsidiaries, if you're finding them in financial difficulties, remember about conflict rules around decision making between the parent charity trustees and the trading sub directors, and also just basic issues of would you be throwing good money at bad if we were continuing to fund something that wasn't viable. Of course, charities could be commercial, so it might be the charity could do that work itself. Restricted funds, if you have them, can you unlock them? Can you speak to a funder to use them more widely? Can you go through Oscar procedures to unlock them? The Australian case there, if you're doing fundraising, whether something that goes viral, as it did with Celeste Barber, or in a slightly more focused way, making sure you take care over what you're funding for, who is receiving it, and in what terms the fundraising is happening, because that could accidentally lock away funds and prevent you using them in the way you want to use them. Or in the case of the Australian situation, it kind of ended up in the wrong place, meaning it couldn't actually be applied for what all the donors thought it could be used for. Just a brief one on the power of legacies. I think this is a really important one for charities to look at. Do you have a legacy campaign or some function for people to leave legacies to the charity? It's been, even before lockdown, a very noticeably powerful way for raising funds. And if fundraising from live human beings falls away, then legacies might be able to shore up some of that. So if you haven't been in the way of doing that, this might be a time to begin to open up that conversation, and very happy to have a chat with anyone about that, about how people can start to do it, because it can be a very, very effective way of doing things. And whilst investments, which can drive the value of legacies, have been affected, the projections about the value of legacies over the next few years are still very, very strong. And for charities who are in the midst of getting legacies, legacy management can be important. Engagement with the solicitors and others to try and get funds a little bit earlier than usual. It could be a wholesale in its own right, but if you're doing new things because of lockdown or engaging in new partnerships all the way through to mergers, there's a lot of things that people need to be thinking about. So particularly taking care there to make sure that you're working with the right people and that there is an alignment between who you're working with. Two organisations that might just be operating in the same area might not actually be the best fit for each other. And all of this, it's about why you want to be doing something, why donors want to fund you, as well as the how side of it. But in some cases with donors, let's look at why they want to fund you. Then that why sometimes leads into how they're going to fund you, and you want to make sure that that how is as simple and inviting and easy for someone to engage with you. Over to the next slide, just a very brief one here. Contentious legacy stuff, always a nightmare. Sometimes people just like to have a fight. Let's try and step away from that. And my top tip here is, if lawyers are involved and they're writing letters to each other, then try and stop them writing letters to each other, because lawyers' letters never help. That is enough on contentious estates. On activities, doing new activities or revamping them or reopening them out of lockdown, remember your purposes. Are they still fit? Are your purposes still relevant, and what you're doing still relevant? That's always a key thing. If we're moving online and digital, there's obviously all the GDPR stuff we should be thinking about, but are we needing to put in place new relationships and new rights with people we are providing material to? Our employees and others who produce stuff for us, do we need new relationships, rights, etc. with them? And making sure when we're going online, risks and safeguarding are set out. And some of that will be tech-based, and some of it will be the basic do's and don'ts of engaging with beneficiaries and others online. And physical reopening, some of that's about how you're going to deliver your activities. Some of that's going to be just the general engagement with the public. Some of it's going to be working with others, and some of it's going to be employment stuff, and setting out how these different things will work to keep people safe, but doing things effectively, and making sure employment and data considerations are considered. Around getting information from the public who might be engaging with you around Trace and Protect, the ICO has issued some guidance. And for some charities who are looking at the new normal and all that, and new working arrangements, we'll be looking at leases to see whether their real estate situation suits their needs. So you might want to be looking at any breaks in leases that are coming up to make sure you can take advantage of them, and also potentially looking at subletting possibilities before taking on any new lease arrangements. And on just to the final slide from me, risk and some new developments. We have a Disclosure Scotland bill that went through and is now passed. That will be changing rules around disclosure. It will impact on safeguarding policies. And again, I'm committing to doing a little blog on that as that new legislation has come out. For charities that own land, the Scottish Land Commission has just issued a protocol for charities and what it expects and what it is thinking the public expects of charities who own land. And I have done a little blog on that to help trustees set out what they should be doing in that regard. Non-domestic rates, that's kind of been postponed for a while. It will come back, and it's not just about schools. So everyone should really just be thinking about how non-domestic rates applies to them, any trading subsidiaries, and also to consider the impact of if they were to lose the 20% discretionary side of that. Another bit on non-domestic rates is your charity's purposes and how they're expressed in your constitution can matter to whether or not you're going to get the charity's rates relief. And risk registers, have a look at them. It doesn't just mean just stick COVID in them, but just having that refresh about what is a risk to you. And it's not just the bad things about risk. I always think risk is about what are the positive, important things that if there was a barrier to how they happened would cause your organisation a bit of an issue. So that refresher of your risk register to make sure it is current and up to date. So that was really the main things I had to say. If you're wanting some other material that relates to some of the bits we talked about today, including a wee note on the Governance Act, then you can head over to the snazziest titled Twitter account you've ever seen there, or visit the blog to see some stuff. But of course, if anyone's got any questions in the chat or otherwise, then very happy to deal with them before we hand over to Andy for the next section.
Hi Alan. We do have a question about the Act. I don't know if there's an echo here, but about the Act and what does it mean for quoracy at an AGM?
I think that's a question that's coming up quite a lot around this, because people are naturally worried that they are going to hold the most fantastic virtual meeting ever, but that they're not going to have enough people at it. Whilst the Governance Act doesn't specifically deal with changing rules for quorums, partly because it wants to ensure that proper governance and engagement is happening, so you still should be encouraging people to be attending the meetings, but very importantly, there is no need to have a quorum of people in the same room at the same time. So you can make up your quorum from people who are joining the meeting in a variety of different ways and from different locations. So hopefully, whilst you still will be aiming for the same quorum level as before, you physically don't need to have people in the same room, and therefore it should be possible to have a functioning and valid meeting with your quorum.
Thanks, Alan. So this next session is thinking about the impact on trading losses on gift aid from trading subsidiaries. So just by way of a refresher, you'll be aware that paying gift aid from a trading subsidiary is a tax efficient way for the subsidiary to provide funds. The subsidiary receives a tax deduction, and therefore the charity receives additional donation income, and it's legally defined as a distribution, so like a dividend. So it can only be paid out of a trading subsidiary's distributable profits. In terms of recognition, FRS 102 states that gift aid can only be recognised either when it's paid or when a legal obligation exists, and that legal obligation clearly can be a declaration of a number pre-year end, or a deed of covenant is a common agreement. So a deed of covenant would obligate the directors to distribute all trading profits at the year end or from the year end, and therefore recognition in the accounts. And for tax deduction purposes, the gift aid needs to be paid within 9 months of the year end for a wholly owned subsidiary. So company directors, before they make a gift aid payment, they need to be satisfied that there are distributable reserves at least equal to the gift aid, and that the company, the trading company, continues to be solvent after that gift aid payment. So what we're thinking about here is what happens if there are losses in the lockdown period. So just looking at a scenario, so you could have a legal obligation at the 31st of December, being the year end, and that legal obligation is either a deed of covenant saying that the profits need to be distributed, or it could be the declaration of a fixed value. And then post year end, there's lockdown, there's shops shut, a cafe may be closed, and so there's trading losses through March through to June. So there is a declaration at the year end. So is there an obligation to pay that gift aid? Must it be paid? And then because there are now losses and eroded distributable reserves, perhaps the question is, can it be paid? So just looking at 3 steps here drawn from the Companies Act, that so prior to declaring gift aid at the year end, interim accounts should be drawn up to confirm that there are sufficient distributable reserves, or there may be a deed and covenant in place obligating it. Then at the date of payment, there's this question about, are there distributable reserves? And then there's the question of solvency. So just an example which is drawn from a real life scenario. So December year end, legal obligation existed because a gift aid had been declared, and that was based on the management accounts that were drawn up, and there were sufficient distributable reserves to declare an amount. And then, as I've said, in lockdown, there was an erosion of those distributable reserves, the losses through the trading subsidiary. So when it comes to the point of payment, the directors have appreciated that there are now insufficient distributable reserves. They also want to retain funds within the trading entity to fund those losses and for working capital purposes. So what the directors have done is they've performed some scenario planning. So they've looked at the level of funds that they need to retain in the subsidiary. They've drawn up interim accounts to consider what the distributable reserves are, and then they've paid reduced gift aid, so ensuring that there are sufficient distributable reserves, and then paying reduced gift aid. And as a result, they've needed to look then at the tax deduction and correct the tax or amend the tax computations. So really, I just wanted to highlight this as a live issue that we're talking about with our client base. That just because a gift aid has been declared, just because there's a deed of covenant, doesn't necessarily mean that the numbers that you were talking about at the year end are the ones that you can now pay. You need to look at the distributable reserves and also look at solvency. So post payment of gift aid, can the trading entity keep going? And what charities can do is a charity can provide a working capital loan to the subsidiary to enable it to keep trading through to when shops and so on can open. That loan can be made round about the same time as gift aid, but it needs to be a separate thing. You can't just pay gift aid on an intercompany account and suggest that it's been paid. So that the gift aid does need to be paid in cash, and then there can be a working capital loan subsequently. So that was it. It was just a short session just to highlight that point, and I'll just see if there's any queries. Right, we will move on then to Lauren.
Hi everyone, so I'm Lauren Mcilroy. I'm a director at Anderson Brown, and I'm just going to have a quick run through on automation today and how it can help you manage your charity finances. So I think COVID has changed the world that we all live in, and I don't think anyone thought when they left their desks in March that they would still be working from home, and actually working from home would be the new normal. And actually, it's what does that look like now going forward? How can we adapt? How can we change? And how can we manage the information that we used to have easily accessible to us in offices? Can we get that online? And this really comes down to real-time information. So are you getting the real-time information that you need for your charity? What does that look like for you? There may be people who left the office in March with piles and piles of paper, and that paper wasn't accessible at home. It wasn't easily available. They had to keep going into the office. I've spoken to several people who've had to go into the office, pick things up. They struggled with scanners, they struggled with lots of things. But actually, how can you automate your finances so that it's there all of the time? And that's what real-time information means. It means that you can access it all the time. It doesn't matter what device you use. You can use a phone, you can use a laptop, you can use an iPad, anything really. You can access your information, and that means that it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what location you're sitting in, because actually it's available all the time. And that means as well that there's no need for remote connections as such. So everything's stored on the cloud, held on the cloud. And you don't need to use a complicated VPN to remote in. I've remoted in before using VPNs, and actually it's really difficult. The connection can be quite slow. You can time in and out, but truly real-time information doesn't need that. Stored in the cloud, and you can access it anywhere. So what does that really mean, other than availability and ease of access? What does that mean? It means actually that you're able to be proactive about your charity's finances and not reactive. If you are behind in processing your information, in actually staying forward with the pieces of paper that you're processing with your bank payments, if it takes you a couple of weeks to actually move that forward, then you're unable to be proactive. You're unable to see what's coming out of your bank account, what's coming up to be paid, because you're 2 to 3 weeks behind. By having real-time information such as bank feeds and your invoices and your supplier payments going directly into your system, it means that you can see immediately, okay, what do we need to do? What's coming up? What's next? And it just gives you that ability to react much quicker and to plan ahead. And plan ahead is something that's really, really important, and it's something that we've seen with COVID. People are looking forward, seeing what they need to do, but without that history of information, that can be quite difficult. Just next one, Andy. So that brings us on to how can automating your finances help you manage and mitigate your risk. So you're always going to have risk, and it's about identifying what those risks are and how having automated finance actually can manage those. So one is board members and always want access to the finances. And what does that really mean? Because actually, if the information takes 6 months to be up to date, then the information's already out of date. But by having real-time information easily accessible to board members, normally in a read-only access, so changes can't be made, but it means actually that they are able to see what's happening, see where the charity is going, and they can also make sensible governance decisions based on information that's available. The next one is expenses approval. Often expenses are a big chunk of charities' paper. they come in piles of receipts. People have them in their pockets, people have them in their wallets, people have them in their cars, lost them, can't find them. But by automating your expenses, it means that you don't need that paper. Honestly, I remember the first time I saw an expenses app and saw you taking a picture on your phone and throwing the receipt in the bin, and it nearly gave me like a panic attack that people were just throwing receipts in the bin. But actually that's what you can do now, and it means that people can get paid quicker, but it also means that you've got a real understanding of what's being spent quicker. I've often seen people 6 months behind at least with their expenses, and you don't really know what you don't really know what those expenses are until the pieces of paper land on your desk. But what this also means is that it takes the pain out of approval. You don't need to fill in paper forms, staple your receipts to it and send them off for approval. They'll just go automatically to your approvers' phones, devices, so they can approve them wherever they are. And it makes the process a lot more efficient. HMRC compliance I'll come back to, that's just really around the gifted, and there's some ways in which the automating can really help with your HMRC compliance. Gifted, and really the cash that's generated from gifted is something which is massive for charities and can take a really long time if you're struggling with your records, and there's a couple of apps which you can use which really assist with that HMRC compliance, and it means that you have all of the information there available and ready if HMRC ask you any questions. But ultimately, it just makes it much quicker for you to be able to do that gifted. And that's really what can take a long time. Spreadsheets, keeping donors' information up to date, it just takes a long time. And that's something which really doing this can take the pain out of. And approval levels and review, this is something that's really important for spent, for expenses, for so many things in a charity. Actually having the appropriate levels and review embedded in your system means that everything is there, everything is readable for everybody who needs to be able to look, and it's accessible for all, and that really takes the pain out of a lot of it, because actually you're not preparing things twice. And we've often seen this when you have to prepare something and then send it away and then put it back in and prepare it again. The 2-3 times touch is what takes everyone a long time. And by actually taking some of the pain and the manual intervention out of this, it means that your staff and you are able to actually spend time on what you want to do and what you need to do, rather than things which can just be done by a system. And that's really what this does. Just the next one, Andy. Grant reporting and applications, and I know that this can be quite painful. With COVID, I think a lot of the grants and have they've tried to kind of slim them down a good bit so that it's not so difficult. But even still, if you don't have your full history available, it's really difficult to do a grant application. And not only your full history, but your forecast with accuracy. And that's what's really difficult. So if you don't have the history and don't have the ability to forecast in a sensible way, it's really hard to do a grant application. By having everything within the system and everything accessible, you can segregate your one-offs. You can exclude those from any grant reporting, and you can actually just bring forward what you know is the true running costs of the charity and what you actually need. And we've seen examples of this where in COVID particularly, clients have been asked to say, okay, what have you lost out on as part of COVID? What have you missed? What funding have you missed because of COVID? And because the information is all available in the cloud, people have been easily able to say, okay, last year we ran these 3 different events that we've been unable to run with COVID. We ran an online event, but we only made 20% of what we normally would with the in-person event. Because as Alan said, Zoom quizzes have kind of lost their appeal on a Friday night. And charities have felt that too. So what that means is that they can actually, with real integrity, say, okay, this is truly what we've lost by missing out on these events. And that's really, really important. And it's not just for grants in COVID, it's for grants all of the time. Actually, what do we need this funds for? What have we spent it on? And you can track and you can keep just a track of everything in your system. It also means that when you do receive grant funding, you're able to segregate those funds. So you can report on individual funds. You don't have to spend time separating things. You don't have to spend time individually looking at different items. As soon as that money is spent, that can be segregated, and that just makes the however quickly you need to report, quarterly, 6 monthly, or annually. That just means that you don't need to spend the time individually segregating and manually segregating funds on your own. And I know from experience that can be really difficult. I used to work in industry before I rejoined practice, and segregating funds was an absolute nightmare in a system that just isn't built to do it. And in a manual system, it's just really hard, and you could never get it quite to work, and it could never quite tie up. And if it didn't tie up, well, it was a disaster. And I think that's something that really actually this just does with ease. When you automate your finances and have it set up in a way that works for you and not in a workaround, then that's actually something that works really well. And I think a lot of finances systems have been set up a long time ago when the purposes weren't the same as they are now. And I think this is really the time that people can look at their finance systems and say, okay, what is it we actually need and what are we wasting our time on? And have a look at that and say, okay, we can't segregate our funds. We can't forecast with accuracy because actually the information just isn't there. And that's something really which can bring just a relief to your day. I know it sounds silly and I sound like a bit of an accountant nerd, but there's something when you don't need to manually reconcile your bank because the information pulls in automatically and you haven't wasted 3 hours looking for a transposed number. Actually, that's a really good thing. And it just means you can spend time helping people and doing what it is that you need to do. I'm just going to, on the next slide, show you a few systems which work really well with this. And we use these day to day with our clients. And there's lots and lots of different options, and these are just a few. A couple of these are actual finance systems. So Xero and QuickBooks are both finance systems. Xero's blue, QuickBooks is green. And they are both cloud systems, fully cloud, that integrate with lots and lots of different apps. And they work really well, and they work with ease on all of the devices, like I said before. Expensify is an absolutely brilliant app. So this is the expenses app that I talked about before. So this is where you can just snap a picture on your phone and throw the receipt in the bin. And this has the appropriate approval levels built in and can just link automatically with your finance system. And then Infoodle. Infoodle is a great app. So this is a gift aid app that just does your gift aid reporting for you, but it doesn't just do your gift aid, it also holds all of your donor information. And this means that you have everything accessible. So it's like a CRM and gift aid together. It's HMRC compliant, and it just takes the pain out of having manual spreadsheets, keeping all the donor information individually. It also just makes sure that you're up to date with your GDPR compliance, and just it means that everything's just in one place. And Futurely something which you can use for reporting, and there's lots of other reporting apps as well. And the thing is, there's so many options for what for what you need, but it's actually about understanding what it is you want to get out of it. What can you do? What are your limitations from not being in your office? What are your limitations even when you are in your office? And what do you think you're wasting some time on and actually would be better spent somewhere else? Because that's really what automation is about. It's about taking some of that time back, which you don't need to spend on things which can be done in a system, and actually giving people the availability of information that they need and that they require, and actually just with ease. So that's really all I wanted to share with you guys today. I'll just double check if there's any questions. But if you've got any questions at all, please just feel free to let me know, because I know it can seem terrifying, changing systems and moving things over, but actually it's something which works really well, and it means that it just makes everything a bit less painful.
Lauren, hi, there is just a question here about this point about throwing away invoices. Does HMRC not ask for them?
No, so HMRC means you need to keep a record, and recently, in recent years, they've changed their records to digital records. So all of the systems I've mentioned, so Xero, Expensify, QuickBooks, all keep the records digitally. So it means that you don't need to keep the paper. And I know that is genuinely a terrifying thought for most people, because they like to have leave arch files full of paper stamped, but you don't need them anymore. You don't need the receipts, you don't need the pieces of paper. And do you know what? I've had a few of my clients have had different inspections, run-of-the-mill inspections for the HMRC, and we give them access to the system, and they're normally done in a third of the time than they would have been before if it had been paper records.
Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing for me, Lauren, because I spotted it the other day when you were going through the slides, and it piqued my interest. So with that segregation of funds, does that mean that if a grant project or something comes in, you then, when that happens, you then set that up in the system as something separate, and it kind of tracks it, and you can find out what's happening with that particular pot as such?
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Alan. So what that means is if you have funding from, say, 5 different sources, you can segregate each one of those funds, and you can report on each of them individually, or together, or a mix of whatever one you would like to. So say you've got 3 from a similar fund, or that work in a similar part of your charity, or you have a couple of different streams. It means that you can segregate them all and design reporting based on what works and what you need to report on. But it's exactly that, Alan. It means that you can have one fund, one reporting, and that doesn't form part of your big pot, but it just can be reported on its own.
That seems very, very useful. And actually, going back to the OnePlus case study I mentioned earlier, I think where the tracking of project-based funding was one of the issues in that situation, having something that allows people at the touch of a button to keep track of how these pots are working, and I suppose on the other side of it, how their unrestricted funding is sitting, must be able to give trustees confidence that they know where they stand.
Yeah, I think you're right, Alan. And previously it has been quite difficult to keep a track of all of the different pots, especially if you have a lot of them. But actually this way it just makes it quite easy, and it's not a difficult setup either, and you also don't need to set them all up at the beginning. So the more you add as you go through, the more you just add into your system, so it's not fixed from the beginning. And I think a lot of people have had issues with that before, where their systems have been too fixed and rigid at the beginning, whereas this provides the flexibility to grow as the charity grows.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for joining our webinar. We hope you found it useful. We've put the contact details on the screen, so please reach out to any of the presenters should you have any queries. And we all hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.